Hello and welcome to the Gonzales Mitchell Show. I'm Clay Mitchell,
And I'm Patrick Gonzales.
and today Patrick and I have a guest who's Len Lucchi. Len is a registered lobbyist who represents business owners, trade groups, and local governments before the Maryland General Assembly and the United States Congress. During his 30 years as a legislative advocate, Mr. Lucci has helped to shape legislation on behalf of his business and corporate clients and creates and enhances marketplaces for their goods and services. Uh, Mr. Lucci is admitted to practice in law in Maryland, the District of Columbia, the U.S. District Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court. Patrick, he can handle your Supreme Court case. We'll talk about that
Yeah,
offline.
well, it's the
Um,
bail thing that's coming up. So,
and Mr. Lucci has more than 30 years of experience lobbying in Annapolis and in Washington. And I want to point out he's a proud member of the Scrapple Trail.
That's right.
Len, welcome to the Gonzales Mitchell Show.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
have
So,
you?
as a lobbyist, what session's coming up? I think in 2 weeks or so. What are you going to be busy doing?
Quite a lot. I think the most uh, publicly prominent thing I'll be working on is I represent the Fair Share Maryland Coalition to make sure that when revenues are raised, they're done in a fair way, not on the backs of working people, but for people who are not paying their fair share now, the top 1% of income producers, as well as the corporations that have uh, loopholes that in Maryland that they need to be plugged up. So we'll be working on that because it appears that with this coming budget, they're going to have to do several things to make it a balanced budget because that's the one thing the Constitution requires the Maryland General Assembly to do. So it'll probably have to be a combination of cuts in programs, or at least cuts in the increase of programs, and revenue increases, and perhaps even an expansion of online gambling. And so we just want to make sure our coalition that when the revenues are increased, they're not done on the backs of working families, like by increases in the sales tax rate, but rather higher income tax brackets for the top 1%, and closing some of these corporate tax loopholes that have out-of-state corporations pay their fair share, so that they are on the same level playing field as Maryland small businesses that do have to pay their fair share.
Now, do you think that the driver of the reason for budget cuts and revenue enhancements, I think is the politically correct thing to say, is due to mandated spending and the formula spending? Is that the part that needs to be adjusted, do you think?
A lot of that, yes. Uh, for 100 years, the legislature was not able to increase spending classifications, or they couldn't even shift from one item to another. 4 years ago, the voters passed question one, which now gives them that power. But because they didn't have that power for 100 years, they had all these dedicated funds to try and require where money comes from and where it goes to. And that's a tough thing to do for budgeting. So I think we're going to see a trend away from that now that the legislature has these budget powers to move things from one line item to another, or to increase or decrease them.
What are some of the budget or corporate loopholes that you see that are out there that may be unfair that you think should be closed?
Well, the prime one is combined reporting. 30 states do have combined reporting, and what that means is that you take all of a corporation's income and you apportion that from just that state. Like for instance, Microsoft, its intellectual property is based in Ireland, and so that income does not get imputed to Maryland, even though obviously Microsoft in Maryland benefits from its trademark. And so our what we were proposing is what's called worldwide combined reporting, where you look at a corporation's total income, then you say, well, that this percentage is from Maryland, and that's how much they should pay. And 30 states have what's called water's edge combined reporting, where they do it um, from the boundaries of the United States, which is still progress. And even states like Texas and Utah that are not known as progressive bastions have combined reporting. And so it's something that Maryland needs to join the rest, and it would help uh, bring in the revenue that should be brought into the state.
So where
Maryland
Maryland,
corporations don't have that option because they're just based in Maryland, and so they're at a competitive disadvantage.
so Maryland is in the minority of states that apply this combined reporting. Is that
That
correct?
do not have combined reporting.
That do not have combined reporting. I
Right.
see. Patrick, what do you think?
Hey, Len, what kind of appetite do you think there is up on the second floor of the State House with the governor to contemplate tax increases, like in the sales tax or the income tax or the property tax?
Well, I mean, Governor Moore has said the past 2 years that such measures he would have to pass a high bar, but I think we're reaching that high bar because to close the $3 billion deficit, it cannot be done just by cutting. It can't just be done by expanding gambling. It needs to be a combination of revenue increases, budget cuts, and I guess some kind of gambling expansion, although that's not really my
Okay,
thing.
just real quick, and I don't want to dwell on it, but I thought expand gambling to what? I thought we had everything, or am I
There's still what do
misinformed?
you call iGaming and iLottery, where you could take out your phone and bet instead of having to buy the scratch off cards. Many states do that.
Oh,
Not
okay.
that I'm advocating for that, but that is a way to expand the lottery and expand gambling in the state. Gaming, I'm
Okay,
sorry. They
gotcha.
don't call it gambling. They call it gaming. Uh,
Gaming.
Being from the Eastern Shore, I have to look out for our interests here. Do you, is there a look at the sales tax where it would affect the entire state? Because if it does, say it goes from 6 to 7% or 8%, whatever it is, that the 9 counties here are fettered to a peninsula that includes Delaware. And right now, even with the way things are with especially retail business, if you live on or about Delaware, they're cleaning our clock. If you want a lawnmower or anything like that, it's not a far drive to go anywhere in Delaware, get it and bring it back into the state, notwithstanding the use tax that's supposed to be reported, which never is.
right.
The impact here would be significant. Uh,
Yeah, that's why our coalition opposes an increase in the sales tax rate
good.
because it falls on the backs of working families. It's even more so on the shore with the Delaware economy. But anywhere, that's something that working families would have to pay. And we think they've already paid their fair share, and the corporations and wealthier people should pay their fair share as well.
Along those same lines, that the transportation infrastructure has become a big issue with roads and bridges and transit and those types of programs. Is there an appetite for a gas tax increase? Uh, and also, you have electric vehicles more and more and more out there. What is a way to capture some of that revenue that they're not currently paying?
Right. I mean, several years ago, the legislature put an automatic increase in the gas tax when the price of gas goes up, and it's been going down. And so sometimes the gas tax goes down. But that's an old revenue source because of the shift towards electric vehicles, which there's a goal to massively increase that by 2035. And so, in order to capture that, you need to capture the vehicle miles traveled from all vehicles, and that can be done either by having automatic toll roads, which you don't feel until you get your bill, or um, there's some technology about putting what's called a governor on your car to actually see how many miles you travel and therefore how much impact you have on the roads, whether it's an electric vehicle or a gas powered vehicle. And people don't like that either, because it's like the idea of Big Brother knowing what you're doing, and in the rural areas you have to travel more miles, and so it would disproportionately affect rural folks. But they got to find a way to make it fair, because as the shift goes towards electric vehicles, that they should be sharing the burden of taking care of the roads. On the other hand, the state wants to incentivize electric vehicles, so you make it too expensive. It's a disincentive. So it's a tough thing to do. But the Transportation Trust Fund, which, as you know, pays for the roads and the maintenance and the new roads and the new projects, is suffering. It's losing funds, and that's why they're having to make cuts. So they're going to have to be innovative in terms of how to raise those revenues and to have it cover the trend towards electric vehicles as well. There's no real easy answer. Our coalition's not dealing with that problem, just the general fund, but it definitely needs attention as well. And there were some measures taken in last year's legislature to increase revenues in terms of registration for your vehicle and things like that. But that it was just the beginning. It's going to need a lot more transformation in terms of raising transportation revenues as well. And I can't really tell you I have the answer to that. But.
Gotcha. What are some of the other projects that you're working on?
One project I'm working on has to do with the wages for tipped workers. I worked on raising the minimum wage in 2014 to $10.10 in Maryland, and in 2019 gradually up to $15. But both times, even though the original bill had an increase for the wages for tipped workers, excuse me, that was taken out of the bill. So right now, tipped workers have a minimum wage of $3.63, barely even the price of a tank of gas. And 8 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have full wages with tips on top for workers. And so we're working to do that. It's a tough fight because we have to go up against the restaurant industry, which is very strong in Annapolis. And everybody has a restaurant in their district who will tell their legislator, please don't make me have to pay more. But they have to pay more for utilities, they have to pay more for rent and for food. And why should they shortchange how much they have to pay for labor? And in the 8 states that do have tips on top of the full minimum wage, they find that tips are actually better and the restaurants do better. But the restaurant industry for 100 years has fought this. We're pretty unique in the world in terms of having these workers compensated by tips as opposed to direct wages from the restaurant owners. No one else has that. It came to the United States after the Civil War, after emancipation. It was a vestige of slavery. Black workers primarily were the ones who had to work for tips initially after the Civil War, and even now, the overwhelming majority of tipped workers are women and women of color, and so it's a real discriminatory thing. And there's some white tablecloth restaurants where tipped workers do very, very well, and bartenders do very, very well, but that's the minority. The majority are people who work at the Denny's, or the Applebee's, or IHOPs, where their tips are really tough to exist on. And so folks have to have a couple of jobs, and it's really time to bring the wages for tipped workers up to the wages for everyone else.
That's if it
Well,
gets passed.
just
Go ahead, Patrick.
a couple of things. It's a delicate balance, because you see, if you overdo it, see what happens with a lot of businesses. For instance, what happened in California when they upped the minimum wage to 20. And I definitely was one of those privileged places, because when I graduated from college, I was tending bar downtown Annapolis at McGarvey's, and we got paid $25 for an 8-hour shift. And but I was making $300 or $400 a night in tips. So that form of slavery was okay to me, and I dig where you're coming from. And you got back, and there was no such thing as taxes on tips when I did it, and I guess I mean that was so long ago. I don't know when they instituted that, but it was a pretty good gig, as you say, in limited places. A lot of places like Denny's and other people are working a lot, and the tips are nowhere near as good. But restaurant biz, service businesses of that type, it's tough, and you got to be careful. And I say that in a broad sense. I don't know what the number is, but anyway.
So our proposal phases it in so it doesn't hit the restaurants hard all at once. It has a tax credit to help them pay for it. It does take away the tax on tips. It requires that if they impose service charges, that they have to disclose whether the service charge goes to the restaurant or goes to the worker. And it's also tied to a gradual raise in the overall minimum wage, and to put that on the ballot in 2026. And so it's time that all workers get a raise by that point, because of the $15 got phased in back in 2019, and there's been a lot of inflation since then. So it is a balance, and it is a complicated matter. And restaurants have had a hard time through the pandemic, but so have workers. In Maryland, 60,000 tipped workers left the restaurant industry during the pandemic and have not come back because they could do better elsewhere. And so it's a balance both ways. Look out for the worker, and also look out for Maryland businesses.
No, exactly. And the other element back when I was doing it was 70-80%, maybe 60-70% was cash. So the tips were in cash, and there was no record of it. And it's a totally different world now. So I dig what you're saying. I dig what
now 98% of tips are through credit cards.
Exactly.
And you see the tipping culture spreading, right? You're asked if you want to leave a tip at the dry cleaners, at Starbucks, at other places where the workers do receive a full minimum wage. But if those employers if their workers get a certain amount of tips through that extra surcharge, they can then lower their wages from the minimum wage to the tipped wage of $3.63. So that's why you see the spread of the tipping culture, because employers want to be able to, in other sectors, want to take advantage of that lower tipped wage.
I was going to say, I think that the difference between Patrick working at McGarvey's as a bartender years ago and today is, like you said, Len, the payment system is now electronic, almost 100%. I think you said 98%. And the focus by the state and federal government on taxing that is now laser focused, where before, when it was all cash, nobody could keep track of that.
Right.
You could leave a waitress a $100 tip. That wasn't getting reported. We know that. But if you leave it on your credit card, that's tracked and easily tracked. And I think you're right that with tipped workers, there's got to be a better way to do this to ensure that they receive a fair wage. And on the other hand, that they're paying what they're supposed to pay in taxes. And I get all that. The electronic payment systems is people pay with their phones. I don't know how you do that, but they just tap their phone and molecules go through the air and it debits and credits the bank accounts. And it's a brave new world. And this is a new problem, like you said, since the pandemic, especially with how to strike that balance Patrick was talking about, while taxing the wages the right way while ensuring that workers are paid fairly.
Right. Another thing I'm working on that I think is fascinating is prescription drug affordability. In 2019, the legislature created a prescription drug affordability board in Maryland, which has just put upper payment limits on how much the state government and local governments pay for prescription drugs. And they've picked a couple of the really expensive ones. This year, we'll be working on legislation to expand that coverage to all Marylanders and not just the government plans. And we found that these expensive drugs that these pharmaceutical companies spend far more on advertising than they actually do on research. And so there is a real, and they charge a fortune. And a lot of people will say, well, I have prescription drug insurance coverage, but what you're paying for premiums is so much higher because of the high cost of prescription drugs. And you have people on Medicare, when they get to that donut hole, who have a big burden of having to spend a lot of money on important prescription drugs as well for heart disease or diabetes or other things like that. And so we'll be working really hard this year to have that expansion go to everybody. And it could be the first state in the nation to do that. Other states have followed Maryland in creating prescription drug affordability boards, but they have not yet gotten to the point of implementing the upper payment limits and how much people will have to pay for these high cost drugs. I'm a diabetic myself, and I have to I'm prescribed different medications for that. And why should I tell my doctor, I want this particular drug because I saw the dancing woman on TV advertising that medication, right? I mean, it costs a fortune, these advertisements, and yet that really shouldn't govern the choice of which is the right prescription for you or the right medication. It should be the doctor using his judgment, and yet so they spend a fortune on that, and then the cost of the medications are sky high, and so it's important for Maryland to take the lead in doing something about that for folks.
Didn't it used to be that drug companies advertise to the doctors to educate them on what the drugs do? I see on television all the time. Maybe I'm just the demographic for it, but there's all these drug commercials anymore, and I wouldn't know what they were. I hope my doctor would know what they were, but I hear you about the amount of money that's spent in advertising a product I just can't get off the shelf. I have to go to my doctor for it. That never quite clicked or made sense to me. Uh,
Right.
that all that money's being spent on
And
that.
yet the same medication across the line in Canada costs so much less because they do have restrictions on how much people would have to pay for those medications.
And
Well,
the inequity.
when Canada becomes our 51st state, we can work out a deal with them.
Right. I was hoping the other thing would happen, that Canada might annex the two coasts of the United States as well as the Great Lakes and do it that way. But
We'll put send a bird to President Trump. Put that message in his ear. What do you think?
I
kind of
think it's a good
scary.
idea.
Meanwhile, he's going to try and take over Greenland and the Panama Canal. So,
Hey, I'd get a place in Greenland, wouldn't you, Patrick?
Oh, I in a heartbeat. I'd want a summer place, winter place, however it works up there. I get my hemispheres confused, but yeah, I'm
but
definitely
it's
investing
melting.
in
So
Greenland.
you might buy a nice piece of property and it might be gone in a few years.
Well, I
You,
guess
you can
water's no issue then.
I mean,
have
I'm working on the
waterfront.
climate stuff as well. I worked a couple of years ago and helping to pass the Climate Solutions Now Act, but now we have to get to those goals, and it's going to cost a lot of money to do that, and a lot of hard work to get to those goals. And so I'm working with all the environmental groups and on that as well. But that's a tough one. It's tough just for Maryland to do it by itself. It needs national leadership, and I fear that we may be going in the wrong direction on that.
Well, Len, I appreciate you, and Patrick, appreciate you joining us today. Uh, we want to have you back on. Keep us up to date what's going on during session. We'll have you back on, and you can update us on what your groups are doing. At some point in time, I got to get down there to Bowie to get to Rips and have some scrapple with you. That will be awesome. Patrick, you know what Rips is?
I can go. I go to Rips quite a bit. Yes, I love it.
There
I
you
do
go.
tons of breakfast meetings there.
Hey,
Yes,
I see a scrapple breakfast in our future. What do you think?
sounds like a plan.
Well, I can tell by the clock on the wall that it's about time we end our show, Len. I'm sorry about that, but it's time to say goodbye, Patrick.
Goodbye, Patrick.
Goodbye, Patrick.
Goodbye, Patrick, and thank you so much for being with us, Len. We appreciate it.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
me. A
Len.
lot of fun.